Hello, everybody. Welcome to session 4, the last session of a SMARTA final conference today. We are waiting 1 or 2 more minutes for the participants to come in, and then we will start this session. Okay. I think we can start. Yeah. So welcome again to SMARTA final conference. This is the last session we have prepared for you during these last 2 days. It was a lovely journey. I think for ourselves, it was a lovely journey. Thank you for joining us and being so active and staying with us so many days. And when I'm saying journey, I'm looking back at almost 3 years ago when we submitted a proposal for SMARTA, and a handful of enthusiasts about rural mobility. We look into what we have to do, what are the issues about rural mobility, how to look into it, and what we should discover. And as a journey, as it was a journey, every single corner of the trip, of the road we had, it was very interesting because we saw another glimpse, another scene, another image. And to be very honest, I think it was a bittersweet, let's say, image. And I dare to say bitter because what we found out that rural mobility is not necessarily recognized as a major policy. It doesn't have any importance at all, in when it is taken the decision on rural communities life. But it was sweet because we saw the enthusiasm of the people, and we saw so many examples of and initiatives of people of trying to develop mobility solutions. We saw many of them these days presented in the conference. But allow me, before we start, to to show you a few housekeeping rules. As you know by now, this is a recorded session, and you can interact with us through the question and answers. And being a panel discussion organized today, we will take your questions. So I'll encourage you to put a lot of questions. Again, if you want to feature a SMARTA conference in social media, please use the hashtag SMARTA 2020. Now, we will have today 3 presentations. We will look at the future of rural mobility because we discussed at the beginning about the policies, what were our recommendations of our project recommendations to the Commission and the European Parliament based on the experience and our findings in the project. And now we saw some very good examples of good practice yesterday, and today we discussed certain findings, and if you allow me, we validated across the participants. Now we are looking at the future. The future is changing. The factors that influences the different aspects of our life are changing day by day. This year was a challenging year, and I'm not coming back to these issues, but we have to be prepared. And what we want to look at is to put mobility higher on the agenda, and we have to recognize it as a major policy from our perspective. Now, we will have 3 excellent presentations today. I will introduce at this moment Laurie Pickup and Linda, that they will speak about rural mobility innovation in Europe, responding to demographic and diverse social change. I think Laurie will start, yeah, and then will be followed by Linda. If you allow me to say, Laurie is an a social scientist. He is currently the chair of the ITF group for rural mobility. You know, they are studying rural mobility, and they are he's working in the mobility for more than 40 years, and it is an enthusiast in mobility and social aspects related with mobility. Linda is part of Nord Radio. It's a research company, and they've been extremely active in the Mamba project, where they look to the social. Linda looked at the social aspects within the measures and the demonstrations they implemented. Without further ado, Laurie, Linda, the floor is yours. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Lucia. And I think SMARTA, Mamba, maybe one or two other projects, there's a new energy pushing for something to be done about rural mobility. We need ambassadors inside the mechanisms of the Parliament, the Commission and national governments to move things on. Certainly rural areas in the future will be quite different. Rural areas are quite different to the rural areas I knew as a child in the late 50s and into the 1960s. They've transformed, and there's no reason why they can't fundamentally transform in the future. Now, Linda and I thought we'd do a joint presentation here just to show you that how closely the projects have come together and worked as a family over the last 2 years. I'm going to be looking at social, and then Linda will feature more on the demographics. So can we have the next slide, please? Yeah, the first thing, of course, is this thing, what is rural? And really, is it a question that we need to ask anyway? The statistics say 27% of the EU lives in rural areas, but there's a huge range of definitions in each member state. Denmark, for example, 300 people is classified as an urban population, and 70% of the Danish population live in these urban defined settlements. That would be a village in some other countries. So then the percentage quickly moves from 25 to 33, and in four member states, it's close to 50. So we're dealing with a substantial part of the European population, and this just doesn't balance with the emphasis that's been given to urban mobility and rural mobility. But I think the two key things that we need to look at are population density and settlement pattern. These are the two main things, and you can think of two axes on this. What is the density of the population? What is the centrality of the settlement? Are they nucleated villages or are they scattered? And you could map comfort zones and possible zones for rural mobility onto that. Now, I think rural mobility does have this double dilemma, and those of you that know Mr. Cellophane from the Chicago film might recognize this, that it's sort of invisible. It's always backstage in the interests of the decision makers, rural. If we're talking about development, yes, it's here, it might be in that bit, it might be in this bit. And then rural mobility is a side stage as well when we talk about rural development. So it's sort of on the edge. And I think, as Marion said yesterday, we need to bring it to the center if we're going to go into the future with some real positive work in the area. Next slide, please. And there is mobility and diversity in rural society. There is a level of populism in rural areas that are declining. Rural societies are more inward looking, they become more defensive. This fantastic book by Robert Woodnow, called The Left Behind, who looks at rural areas and small towns in the US. And we can see the countryside alliances, such as this one in the UK, where a simple issue that not everyone in rural areas would agree with, in this case it was fox hunting, actually brought everyone together to think that their traditional rural society was being threatened as a whole. And on the other hand, people crave for the village effect. Susan Pinker's classic book there, particularly in post-pandemic times, people are looking to go into these archipelagos of villages, perhaps where they can get a better quality of life. This has been spoken about in the conference. And so in terms of future rural society, as we move forward, you've got this transition between an imbalanced rural society where people feel inferior and marginalized. And on the other hand, you've got a rural balanced society where there's identity and there's vibrancy and this community spirit that people are talking about. And in this, accessibility and mobility do play an absolutely central role. Next slide, please. So rural areas globally and in Europe, of course, are places of rapid social change. They're not sleepy areas, we all know that. But there's a variety of identities in rural areas now. There's traditional homegrown and there's imported narratives. Next one. And these are the 4 sectors that I've shown in many presentations this autumn. Every rural area has a cocktail of these types of markets, and they're changing over time. You've got the traditional core of the rural economy, mining, forestry, farming, fishery, and so on. Then you've got the incomers, and there's David Beckham there with his clean Range Rover that's never even seen a field, and he's come out. But equally, there are people coming back to work in rural areas like me. I couldn't live here without the internet, and I've come back into a rural area to work and have a different lifestyle. There are the homecomers, those that have been away and now can use perhaps the internet to come back into areas and work in rural areas. And there are many examples of this in rural areas and in the islands of Europe. And finally, there are the tourists and the seasonal workers who come in and are visitors for work or for pleasure. And so you get this mix, and they've all got different levels of mobility. And of course, one needs to be sensitive when we talk about rural communities, if we're talking about what we're actually talking about. Next slide, please. And so you get structurally weak regions in Europe with poor access, where the 10T network is simply a 2-lane road, although the internet level of internet might be considerably better. But in these areas, some very interesting research in Europe has shown that you get a mix of identities, even in areas such as this. Some people feeling resigned, disappointed, disempowered. And this can feature elements in society. We've spoken about lack of access for younger people and for older generations. But at the same time, in the same community, you can get people with strong coping strategies, highly resilient and future orientated. So it's how to work with this when we develop mobility schemes. Next one, please. So it depends on the position in the rural to urban continuum. And as I've just mentioned, many rural areas are getting good internet now, but have they got digital mobility skills in traditional communities to make use of the types of things that Eleonora was talking about before the break? I was speaking to a professor in Bulgaria on this subject last week. So bottom-up mobility innovation for rural communities has an important role to play, but we now need to be careful and sensitive to social structure. Next one, please. And so, last 2 slides, I think, changing the rural planning mindset. This is what we need to do, but it's mindset, don't throw this just on individuals. This has to run through stakeholders and decision makers and champions in decision-making organizations. Mobility is essential for maintaining vibrant and balanced rural communities in Europe. And the rural mindset won't be very welcoming to an urban-centered narrative. This has got to be handled very, very sensitively, and starting with rural communities themselves. And so we need bottom-up rural greenprints, I call them, not blueprints. Next one. And finally, we've moved from transport to mobility to accessibility. Now, accessibility studies have been back since I started in the 70s. We were looking at accessibility indices. So it's a sort of terrain of the 3 over time. But finally, we're coming back to an emphasis on accessibility after 20 years of sustainable mobility. We need to try and develop this village effect. And this is clearly something that is becoming more popular in the mindset. We need to adopt the third question principle, that firstly, mobility is on the internet, then it's done through the internet with delivery, and thirdly, I need to travel. Can I get it locally? Is it accessible locally? Then we're going to get close to our low carbon targets. So we need to start with strategies for rural areas for travel avoidance, and this came up in the discussion before the break, but also at the same time, be very careful and develop diversity strategies to deal with diverse society that exists in our rural areas at the moment. Otherwise, people will start to leave. And this is where demography becomes very important. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Linda.
Good, very good segue, Laurie. Thank you. So moving on from, I guess, Laurie's given us a really nice picture of the kind of the social context for this work. And I just want to finish with some words about the Mamba project. So Mamba is quite, in some ways, a similar project running side by side with SMARTA, in that we also focus on rural mobility. But I think there's two kind of key differences that are maybe good to highlight. So the Mamba project is specifically about maximising mobility and accessibility of service in regions that are affected by demographic change, so rural areas that are undergoing demographic change. And the second thing is that Mamba project is focused only in the Baltic Sea region, whereas SMARTA is whole of Europe. So I think this map kind of captures both of those things quite nicely. And I think there's just three things that I want to kind of highlight from the map. So the map shows population change from 2000 to 2018 in the Baltic Sea region, and with the red colours showing out-migration and the blue colours showing in-migration. So an increase in population over that time. And I think that, there's obviously a trend towards out-migration in many rural areas of the Baltic Sea region. You can see particularly there in the north of Sweden and Finland, the Baltic states, Eastern Germany. We see some quite dark red spaces. But I think we also see quite a lot of blue in rural areas as well. So I think it's important to note that this kind of grand narrative of rural decline, it's not universal. It's not the experience everywhere. And I think even where we do see demographic change and population decline, our experience with Mamba tells us that actually the individual experience in different places is likely to be quite different. And I think for many of the reasons that Laurie has already discussed. So the core of the Mamba project was actually a number of mobility centres and mobility pilots that were developed in rural regions around the Baltic Sea region. And I don't have time to tell you about all of them, unfortunately, but if you jump on the Mamba website, you can find them all and you can find the great people to speak to about them. But I'll just touch on a couple. So in Vidzeme planning region and in the county of Plön, we had two transport on demand services. Same service implemented in a completely different way for a completely different population. So in Vidzeme, the population is quite scattered. There's not really any other modes of transport, and the population needs many are quite elderly and might need assistance. So here it's a single car. You have a driver that can help you out if you need, and people pick up the telephone and call if they need a lift. In the county of Plön, it's not so far to a larger centre with a train. There's also a fairly well-established bus lines, but the service is not so frequent. So here it's an on-demand smaller bus that can be called to along the specific bus line at a given time for the person. So same solution, different community, different geography, different application. Similarly, when it comes to technology, in Vejle municipality in Denmark, the municipality worked together with a technology company to develop a ride-sharing app that was specifically designed for Danish rural communities. So Laurie mentioned in the beginning about Denmark that actually there are many quite sort of small settlements that might be considered rural in another country, but they're often, in this case, particularly in the case of the place where this app was developed, they're quite close to an urban settlement. So you've got many people sort of living a bit scattered, but all going in the same direction. So here, this kind of ride-sharing concept works quite well. And nabo in Danish is neighbor. So it's like go with your neighbors. In North Karelia, in Joensuu, we have a bit more public transport going on, but it's quite messy and a bit all over the place. So here the solution was to bring everything together in one app. And so yeah, technical solutions, but different contexts, different institutional setting, different application. Finally, I think one thing that the Mamba project was quite focused on that I'm not sure if SMARTA is so much interested in is this notion of people to service to people mobility. So actually bringing the services to the people. And again, applied in really different ways in different contexts. So in Trelleborg in the south of Sweden, we see a little bit this trend that Laurie talked about of these incomers. So people who are perhaps working in Malmö, which is a bigger city, the third biggest city in Sweden, and maybe they want more of sort of a rural lifestyle. So they're living here in Trelleborg, commuting to Malmö. Maybe they have kids at home. Maybe they don't want to go every day. So here was a co-working space. In Hallehuge in Germany, again, service to people, but this time a mobile counseling, so an online counseling service for, and I think this is a particularly interesting project because the theme was around, like the problem to be solved, I guess, was around people's fears of growing old in this very remote community. So it's an island actually. And people were not having high levels of they're not technologically savvy, not comfortable with technology, but a technical solution. And so I think the important takeaway with this approach was that a big portion of the development of the service was around capacity building for the residents to be comfortable to use this new solution. So to kind of wrap up, and that was a very, very quick summary of a 3-year project. So I hope that you will help me out with the panel and ask me all the questions of all the things that I wish I could have time to tell you right now. But I think if Laurie and I put our heads together and said, okay, if we take all of that from both the projects, our reflections, what do we want to tell you about our kind of wish for the future of rural mobility? And I think really, perhaps one of the a really important one is, and it might seem kind of obvious, but I think it's good to always remind ourselves, we talk about rural communities, but the IES is very important part of that phrase. There's no one rural community. So the social mix, the geographical specificities, but also the institutional context play a really important role in determining which mobility approaches are going to work best. And maybe it's not one solution, maybe it's sort of a bunch of little building blocks that come together to make a one rural community more mobile. Second, it's always a changing, moving target. It's not one problem that we can solve and then good, we fixed that one. It's going to be a constant renegotiation. And I think we've learned from this conference, also from Mamba project, that actually rural mobility, it's not a high priority. So we need to be well integrated with the broader community development strategies of different rural places. So is a place is it growing? Is it shrinking? And we don't want that, we want to grow. Is it shrinking? And we're okay with that. We just need to manage the shrinkage. Very different approaches depending on that strategy. And finally, I think my biggest takeaway from Mamba was really about this idea of innovation and what it is. And I think innovation in rural mobility, it doesn't have to be, wow, this is this thing that we've never seen before. It's actually more about the way that the thing comes about. And so something can be novel in a particular context, and it can come about in an interesting or innovative way. So I think we're having everyone on board and thinking differently about the types of actors that come to the table to make something happen, I think is actually for me where the real innovation and the real successful innovation was in the Mamba project. So apologies, I think we went a little bit over time. I hope it was worth it. And we'll see you again in the panel. And please check out all the resources from Mamba project on Mamba website. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Laurie. Excellent presentations, excellent points that you are making, and it shows that your presentation shows the complementarity and the good collaboration that we have had in our projects. And nevertheless, I really like the point that it came out actually from the discussions these days. What is actually the rural community? How we can define rural community? Now. I don't want to spend too much time, but I would like to invite Odette to present. She is the representative of the Department of Mobility and Public Works in Flanders. She works at the MAS principle within the framework of basic accessibility within this department. She has a very extensive experience in DRT. She was responsible for implementing the first demand responsive transport system in Flanders. So she has a long experience in understanding rural mobility and developing schemes for rural mobility. So Odette, I will share your presentation if you bear with me just 2 seconds. I think this is it, yeah?
That's it. Okay, thank you very much, Lucia. What I want to talk to you about is, in fact, a little bit Flemish legal framework we're creating for mobility. And I called it Towards Mobility 2.0 because I think in the Flemish region, we have a tradition in trying to put a legislation in working that offers a framework in order to offer everyone some kind of mobility. And if we go to the next slide, you will see we started, in fact, that way of working in 2001 with the basic mobility legislation. And that legislation, in fact, aimed at offering each citizen a minimal amount of public transport according to a number of legal standards. And the standards that were used were the residential areas where the people were living, the maximum distance to the stop that had to be applied, the frequency was within the legislation that we had to offer in each kind of zone, and the amplitude we had to serve that zone during days, weekends, and also peak and off-peak moments. As you can see, it's quite an offer-oriented legislation that we had there in place. And although it's had its positives because everyone within a living area had a bus stop quite nearby, the maximum distance to a bus stop was 750 meters. We realized after a number of years that that type of network wasn't a solution to everything. And so people within the governments were thinking we need something new and something that's new, more performant than the offer we are having now. And that's when the idea of basic accessibility, as we call it, was born. And that's a more demand-oriented principle, which guarantees access to important social places on a demand-driven basis by different means of transport. That also means that we will be working with different layers within our network and different parties that will be responsible for the different layers within the network. So we can go to the next slide. That means that we have, in fact, here a new way of thinking about mobility, a new policy and a new plan, and that it is a policy that is quite recent. is proven by the fact that we only have that legislation since April of last year. We have the legal framework, and what we're doing now is in fact trying to implement all our plans within that legal framework. And if we go to the next slide, we can see what are the social and economical objectives of the system we are aiming at. As we already said, we want to make important social functions accessible on the basis of a demand-oriented system. And we want the kind of the transport that we are offering, that it will be used, that the optimization of the use of that transport and the final resources we invest in transport. So there is a focus on combined mobility when we talk about the transport of persons, but that combi mobility has to be facilitated, and how we will do it, that I will talk about that later on. We also need to capture, integrate and simplify the operation conditions of all collective transport initiatives or customized transport, because we're aiming at customer centricity. If there is one thing the customer wants, then it is that a simple have a system to go from A to B is simple to use, and that's what we are going to try to offer. And last but not least, I would say, is the creation of shared responsibilities between the various actors. Before, we saw in Flanders that, okay, the Flemish region makes the legislation. Okay, so now we have transport and everything. If it isn't working, okay, that's a responsibility of the Flemish region, and they have to look at how they can improve things. They have to invest more money. They have to look at how we can reach out to the customer and warm him up to the offer that is there. But in the new policy, we aim at sharing the responsibilities and do a kind of co-creation with the local authorities and transport regions we have created. And so let's go to the next slide. If we want to implement that kind of system, that will mean that we have a certain kind of model, tools, processes, and structures that we will be needing. So if we continue on the next slide, you will see this, the new model we have created. Here you see a map of Flanders. And we, in fact, have divided Flanders in 15 transport regions. And there are transport regions that are larger, there are ones that are smaller, but the division has been made on the fact the cooperation and the interaction of transport between the different communities that are within the regions, they have been one of the main determinators to create the regions and define the borders of the regions. So within those regions, all communities will have to work together to create a regional mobility plan. And that brings us to the next slide. Because that regional mobility plan, that has to fit within the Flanders mobility plan, of course, and of course also within the Flanders mobility space plan. So you know, or you don't know, but Flanders is very creative when it comes to building. And if you're talking about cities and communities and little villages, people in Flanders live everywhere, so we don't have really pools of homes and then a road in between. So it's a very bad mix to create a good transport. And before, with the basic mobility, it was like every local community had to make a mobility plan. So every community did that, but they all looked only at their own community and not at what was happening outside their communities, unless it were very large cities where they wanted to go to, but they didn't really look at the economical and social functions on a lower level that were very important for their inhabitants. And that's what we want to create here. Now they have to look together at what's happening in their transport region, and they have to make decisions together within the transport region. Which brings us to the next slide, and that means they have to look at different tools to create their plan. First of all, the tool that they have, of course, is the network, meaning the road network, bicycle network, the public transport network, and also the water network. Another tool, which we find on the next slide, is, well, it's not another tool, but it's one I want to show you a little bit more in detail, is a public transport network. When we say it's a demand-driven network, basic accessibility, then demand-driven here means to have the right vehicle in the right place at the right time. So if we look at our network, you can see that there will be 4 layers within the network. The train, which is the backbone of the system. Unfortunately, that's not the responsibility of the Flanders region, but that's on a federal level. The core network, those are the high density access between the larger and regional cities. The feeder network, as we call it, those are lower density access, and they can be either functional, which means that they only will be provided in the morning or in the evening for people who go to work, or children and teenagers that go to school, or can be non-functional. They will be driving the whole day, but they will not be as quick and as fast as the core network high density access will be. And then the last layer is what we call customized transport. But to make it easier for you, we will call it first and last mile transport. Within that, another tool on the next slide, please, which is very important in the network we are creating, that is fixed on combi mobility, is what we call a mobi point, and that you can see as a place, a transfer place, where between the different layers of transport, where all kinds of transport come together, and where people can go from one means of transport to another. What is very important for us is that those transfer points need to be very safe and comfortable for the user of the transport. He needs to feel at home, he needs to feel safe, and we want to offer also additional services. For example, it can be a place if you order something by the website, where you can pick up your packages, where there is a place where you can have a drink and so on. So it needs to be really comfortable. And then next slide. Another tool that is very important is a mobility center, because in fact that's the brain of the whole system, if I may call it so, because that will facilitate the planning and booking of trips, because every information about the entire network, and that means the 4 layers of network, will be in the system. And the customer can call in the center in different ways. He can do it by web, by phone, by app, or even by chat, and he will get a solution for his transport questions, for how he can go from A to B. And it has to be said, as we are looking at from a Flemish point of view, So the standard solution a customer will get will be a sustainable solution, because that's also one of the aims that we have with our mobility that we want to create on all levels. That is that we want to respect the sustainability. What is also integrated in the system that we offer by the Mobility Center is that every person that calls in will have a mobility profile that we automatically generate from other systems we have within Flanders with data. And that is also very important because, for example, for people who have in fact disabilities, like they are in a wheelchair, or it's very difficult for them to walk long distances, for example. We know their profile, and as we know their profile, we also know that we have to plan their trips from door to door. They don't need to go to a bus stop like the other users need to do, which will be using our transport network. And that brings us with the following slide. To give you an idea from the structure within where we are working in, we see in fact that the system we have is both a top-down system, because the Flemish region has created the legislation, but it is also a bottom-up system, because within the transport regions we have created a transport council where the municipalities and all kinds of stakeholders are represented, and they together have to create both the first and last mile transport network, as well as the additional network. And then we go to the following slide, and we can see who can decide over which network. As I already told you, the train network, that's a federal competence. So we talk about it with the federal state, but we can't make any decisions about the network. Then we have the core network that will be decided by the Flemish government, but they have to look at the advice that the local transport region council will give about the network. And if it's valid advice, they also can follow that advice. When we look at the feeder network or the additional network, that kind of network will be decided by the Transport Region Council. So that will be decided very locally, and all kinds of customized transport that can be a part of that network are also decided at the Transport Region level. And when we're talking of the customized transport, first last mile transport, I think it's important here to emphasize that we're not only talking about DRT systems, they will be part of it. We're not only talking about a regular user of public transport, but we are also talking about the transport of people with disabilities. And we're talking about, in fact, bringing those two groups together if and when possible within the demand. There also will be shared systems within our public transport system, and that can be either cars or bikes. And then I come to my last slide, and as you can see, we have in fact a very ambitious plan, as we want to go live on the 1st of January of 2022. And go live mean that the whole transport system and all elements of those systems have to be up and running on that date. The Mobility Center will be working, and a number of very important MOBI points will be created by that date. So so far my story. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Odette. It was such an interesting presentation, you know, I really look forward to understand more about how the discussion between so many stakeholders, you know, will take place in the future, you know, just to keep the system going like you presented. Now, I will encourage all the attendees to put questions in the panel of questions and answers, because I'm not taking any questions at this moment to any of the presenters, but I will take questions later on in the panel discussion. So may I introduce now Edina Osko. She is the director of the E40 group. It's an international consultancy, but she is here because she's coordinating a preparatory actions on smart rural areas in 21st century, and she will present this project. So Edina, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So welcome everyone. As Lucia was telling, I will be presenting the project, which we shortly call Smart Rural 21 project. The full name is much longer, so that's why we shortened it. It's Preparatory Action for Smart Rural Areas in the 21st Century. And it is a project supported by DG Agri. So it's an EU technical assistance project. Essentially, the purpose of this project is to support selected villages in developing their smart village strategies. And it was a very challenging task at the beginning of this project, which started back especially actually exactly 1 year ago. So it was a key task to actually select villages for the purpose of this project according to a series of selection criteria. And on this map, you actually see the selected villages. We also had to pre-select villages when we applied to this project. And that's what you see down in the chart, the list of those we pre-selected before the project actually started. And then the recently selected, or not so recently now, additional 16 villages. So we are supporting these villages in developing smart village strategies across Europe, and then of course try to draw lessons across Europe from this experience. It was very interesting to hear all these presentations, because probably I will resonate many of the things that have been said and what we experienced through this project. So what I wanted to start with is the key challenges of villages. Actually, it's just a very quick overview of the challenges that people, or actually the villages, the village applications mentioned as key challenges of their villages. So essentially, you can see, and I can confirm the title of this presentation, that rural mobility matters. Of course, it's just a snapshot, and we would need to look in much more details into the 734 applications that we received. But you can see that some 9% of those villages mentioned the lack of proper transport connection or other mobility issues as key challenges. So it was not the most quoted challenge or highlighted challenge, but it still matters. It's one of the most mentioned ones. So coming to the next slide, and that again resonates a bit with what other presenters and panelists said today, like Laurie was emphasizing the differences and the diversity of issues that rural areas are facing. And that's what we found when we look more in depth into those responses. So essentially, the kind of challenges will obviously very much matter depending on the area, on the type of area. So we need to make a distinction between different types of areas and how we address these key challenges there. So obviously there are rural areas where remoteness matters. Either it could be mountainous areas as well as border, but other characteristics as well. Whereas we also find areas where actually are close to urban centers, as we also heard today. So the challenges will be obviously very different in the two. One of the key issues mentioned, of course, is the dependency on private transportation, so the lack of appropriate transport means, which is particularly impacting certain groups. The other thing, of course, as I mentioned, those which are close to urban centers, the challenges will be very different. So it could be traffic congestions, lack of public or alternative transport means for nearby areas. So these are the typical challenges that we are facing there. And then there are some related issues, I would say, such as some villages want to focus or facing difficulties in terms of alternative transport, such as bicycle, walking paths, different kind of mobility issues, and also the connection between the villages which are near to each other. And maybe another challenge which came out quite strongly among the mobility challenges is the seasonal fluctuation. So especially in those areas where tourism is a key sector for development. So this is just to give you a highlight, because I just wanted to stress through that, that while the Smart Villages approach covers a wide range of issues, mobility is one of the key issues that should be integral part of this concept. So this, with this, I'd like to move and talk to you a bit more about the project itself. This is a quite complex graph. It's an infographic where we explain what we do in the project, but I will try to guide you through some of the steps. So firstly, if you look at the middle, this aims to demonstrate that we are actually working directly with these 21 selected villages, but actually the pool of villages is much larger. Because of the huge interest in the process, we extended a so-called come along process, where any village can get involved in the project and benefit from some of the tools that we are doing. So there we are dealing with a much larger number, some 170 or probably now even more villages. So we are trying to support these villages, and I straight want to direct your attention at the bottom of the screen, which says Smart Village Strategies. And sorry, it's automatically moving, so I might need to jump back time to time. So the Smart Village Strategies matter because they really offer an integrated approach to the rural challenges, and mobility is one of them. But I would like to stress here, and I think again it was mentioned today, that these transportation issues cannot be seen from isolation from other challenges. So what we would really like to encourage the villages when we develop, and actually we are just concluding the strategy development process with the additional 16 villages, is to think about more holistic integrated approaches. So where one activity is connected to another one, and try to find kind of holistic responses as well. So this is one of the key things we are trying to work on with the Smart Village strategy. And just listening to the last presentation, I would like to also stress maybe that it's very important that these villages cannot act in isolation. So especially this is a typical situation when it comes to mobility, that it's very important to try to link these local smart village strategies to higher level regional, micro-regional strategies, as we just saw in the previous presentation. So we are trying to encourage the villages to also highlight those linkages or think about those linkages and not to act in isolation. So many of the things that were mentioned today really fits into the smart villages concept, I believe. On the left-hand side, so when you follow the road, it's just some of the activities that we are doing in this project. So we are trying to support the villages through different tools, be it expert advice, specialist advice to develop strategies and later to implement actions. We are trying to strongly encourage exchanges between them. So that's on the left-hand side, this on the road graph animation, which is kind of presenting that villages hopefully maybe still within the period of this project will be able to visit also in person other villages, but of course we are already facilitating online exchanges. We are also trying to do training events, Smart Village Academy events, we call it, where villages can share experience between each other, but we are also trying to build capacity there. And then once these strategies are done, which is actually the phase where we are now in this project, we are really trying villages, encourage villages to take action. And try to support them as much as possible within the project with concrete on the ground hands-on actions to start implementing their strategies. But it will be very important, and maybe that can be a subject of the discussion as well, to somehow try to create policy tools that can support the villages in a more integrated way, or rather to say that support the different kind of actions from different policy tools, so kind of support the villages further on their journeys. So this is what we are doing in practical terms of the villages. You can access this graph also on our website, and what you might want to look at also is the darker circles, because those are the things we are also trying to share with those who are interested in the Smart Villages approach. And one of them, which is in the left bottom side, is the Smart Rural 21 Smart Solutions. So essentially we are trying to share good practices here. And I think this is also an area where we need to create even further linkages with projects such as SMARTA and Mamba, because I think there are a lot of solutions out there which could be shared through also the tools of the project. So I just brought two very quickly. One of them is currently being developed into a smart solution, but not yet. This one from Wales. I'm sure you know much more these examples, and you've been discussing these examples in the past days. But this is really about car sharing model, but also since there are 2 electric cars introduced by a social enterprise, also with volunteer drivers in these communities, it's very much about raising awareness about sustainability issues, which again shows the connection of transport issues to other type of issues. So this project, which we are developing into a smart solution now, is really about this car sharing example, which is managed by a social enterprise in the community. And of course, the main purpose is to benefit those community members who otherwise cannot move that easily. And another example I just wanted to highlight at this stage is a very different one. And that's again, just to show the diversity of issues and the diversity challenges that these villages are facing. So this is from Monteverde in Italy, which is a village which essentially tried to change both physically and digitally, adapt the village to make it more accessible, especially in the context of welcoming tourists and visitors. So again, the focus on people with different types of physical disabilities that they try to focus on, so to attract more people and tourists to the area, which again leads to a similar point that again, this is not just an isolated mobility project, if you'd like, very different from the one that I just showed, but it's very much an economic perspective, and of course a social perspective that it offers to attract more tourists, and of course to help people with disabilities. So this is just to show the diversity of issues that are coming up also in our project. So these are some of the contacts. The car share project, I put also the contact of the project promoters, because it's not yet up a smart solution. The other one you can also find as a smart solution. So questions about the project or these issues are very much welcome. So it's more or less what I wanted to share with you today.
Thank you so much, Adina. It was a very interesting presentation, and I really like the approach, and I wish you good luck in the project. We will follow your findings very closely. Now, as I said, we will have a very nice discussion. May I kindly invite Odette, Linda, Laurie, and even Brendan, if he is with us, if he wants to join us, yeah, to have a nice discussion. We have some questions in the panel, in the question and answer panel, but I think I will start with one. I think one first observation from all the discussions, Linda and Edina, if you want to put the cameras on, I can, yes, thank you. I can see you now. One of the first observations is I made from all the discussions we had from the first sessions until now is to understand rural communities and how we can define the rural communities. And this is coming from not only from demographic aspects, but from the importance, the role in territorial and social. Do you have any quick point here to make? What is it for you? We had very interesting presentation and your points of view, but if we have to take further one single point, what do you think it should be? Please just raise your hand. Yes, Laurie, please.
Yeah, well, I focused on the social dimension and the future social development of rural areas in Europe. And I think one thing that's important is the question of poverty in rural areas and addressing poverty. There is a high proportion of poverty on all of the indicators in rural areas, but poverty isn't just an economic poverty, it's a lifestyle poverty. I think that's important. And I think particularly for people at either end of the age range, the young, teenagers, and also the elderly. And I think this is an important issue that we need to address, this diversity issue. So I just bring that onto the table, poverty in its widest sense.
Yes, I saw Brenton.
Can I just add to that? I think for me, when you're looking at a rural area, there's actually two dimensions. One is, what is the nature of the rural area? What can be seen, can be measured, and so forth. The second is, what's the dynamics of that area? The relationships, the history, and so forth. If you wish to work with a group of stakeholders, perhaps more so than an urban area, you need to understand how they work. So what looks, one rural community and another that may look the same by what you can measure may actually function very differently. That's not a complaint, it's just simply an observation that we always need to keep in mind.
And I think I can pass this this observation to Ode, because she showed the map of Flanders, and we know that it's a vibrant area, and it's not a characteristic rural area in our accept, you know, very, let's say, remote. Is very vibrant area. Therefore, the how you presented very nicely, you know, the link between different stakeholders and the levels of offer that you have there, it's very important. But working with stakeholders is very difficult. I'm really interested in your point here, Odette.
Well, for us as well, that the working with stakeholders is a new experience. We started working on the mobility plans with the transport regions last year. And for the moment, in fact, they are wrapping up their transport plans, which are the first part of the mobility plans. And what I can say, in working together, it started off very difficult, because within a region, you always have the larger participants, larger cities, and the smaller villages, or what we call small villages. But there we had a rule that each community or city, however large or small it is, only has one vote, which means they have to talk together and have to agree on things sitting on the table. Because if they don't agree, there won't be a plan, and there won't be offered money by the Flemish region to create either a part of the additional network, as we call it, or the first and last mile transport. And so if they want to create solutions within their transport region, they will need the money. So it's a little bit give and take we have created there. And then we want to give them the freedom, as also was said here by Brendan, because you can't compare regions with one another. They might look the same, but they can function very differently. And they can be in need of different solutions in different regions. And that's the point where they have to sit together and think together. And because we don't know, they don't do it just like that, go sit together, have a nice meeting and agree on everything. To start up the process, we added to the transport region consortia of a consortia which helps them to create a plan and which guides the process. And that's also something that is financed at this moment by the Flemish government to get everybody in the right direction and to go that way. And as the discussions go further and further and they have to agree on what they can and cannot do, you see the discussions intensify because politicians only want to do good for their community because they want to represent their voters. But now after, let's say more or less a year and a half, you see that you get some interaction and they begin thinking the one for another or add to one another's process and say, oh, if we do that, that also would be good for my community. Oh, you're going to use bikes to go to the car network. Well, in fact, yes, not everybody has to go by a bus to the nearest movie point. Well, for the younger people, shared bikes might work. For very local, let's say, traits, it also can be very functional that you can go forward and backward by bike without owning a bike or taking a bike. So it's kind of a process that is developing. And of course, we also have something that we have as a last resort within the Flemish region. If within the transport regions, it might be the case, it isn't for the moment, but it might be the case that they don't agree on the plan. Well, then there is no plan. And we will provide the Flemish region, then will tell that will be the offer for the people that are living there, but that also will mean if they don't agree that they will not be getting a certain amount of money to do infrastructural works. So
very interesting point, or that I'm thinking the complexity of the discussions you have, because you are talking on different levels, from the national level to the regional level to the local level, bigger or smaller communities, pressure from bigger city, small communities, and the vote is equal. So I think it is a very, very important, let's say, role that you have, and I do hope that everybody will come to the discussion table rather than being imposed something, to be let's say accepted jointly the solution. One question, one issue that it again raised very nicely these days is the funding, as you said correctly, and you approached this subject. I'm thinking, when we are talking about funding for rural mobility, they are on-off. They are in 2 years' time. It's not a continuity of a program, of a project that allows rural communities, local authorities, local rural authorities to access. And I'm thinking, what do you think? And I'm looking at Adina, and Linda from their experiences. What do you think if local authorities will have access to a pot of money continuously to develop the project? Because we discussed the other day, the projects maybe are smaller, are not large in value, and importance like in cities. But in smaller communities, this pot of money or availability of this pot of money will be important. What is your opinion? What do you think?
Yes, maybe I can just add to it. I mean, definitely what I think is great in the Smart Villages concept, although there is no set policy framework yet, that it's kind of a cooperation. It started off as a cooperation as well between the different DGs also in the Commission. So there is this recognition that it's not just single funds that should support these types of initiatives. And I think it's a huge opportunity. Of course, it's also like still a flexible framework and a bit risky, like what will member states especially do with that opportunity and whether they will allocate funds. But this is what we would like to encourage within this project, but also in terms of, especially in terms of the policy recommendations, that these kind of initiatives shouldn't be seen in isolation. So what we see in many villages that we work with, that they just apply for a project because funding is out there for that type of action, but it's somehow not integrated into a more holistic village strategy. So of course it can cause disappointment if they develop a strategy and then they don't see it being financed, but at the same time it's a very important step that they start to think without yet the exact financial means, try to think about integrated approaches and so on. And this is what I find very important in relation to mobility. I think probably everybody agrees that it cannot be seen just fully in isolation from other type of challenges, as I was also mentioning in my presentation. So in the Smart Village context, it's still to be seen, but I think there is a great opportunity not just to finance and support it through a single policy, but hopefully a combined one.
Thank you, Edina. What do you think, Linda?
Yeah, I can maybe build a little bit on that from our experience in Mamba. So we just finished actually working on one of our final deliveries, which is around the cost effectiveness of mobility solutions in rural areas. And I think putting this in the context of demographic change, one of the things that we were quite keen to look at was, I think if we just take a simple cost-benefit analysis approach to mobility solutions, we will find that they are not cost-effective. If they were, we would have many companies coming to rural areas to provide mobility solutions. But if we take a more holistic approach, and I think in the Mamba context, particularly looking at this demographic change question, I think there is a question a little bit about restructuring of funds in order to think about, okay, how can increased accessibility and mobility actually save money in other policy areas? So what we set out to do was actually demonstrate that by having access to mobility or accessibility, a person could, for example, live in their own home for longer. A person could have access to an educational opportunity that they might not otherwise have had. A person could get a job. And I think for us, that was, I mean, of course, you know, there's a lot of work to still do, but we sort of started to try to work with this idea. And I think for regions and municipalities, particularly, I mean, I work mostly with the Nordic region, but I mean, we have this situation where the tax base in a municipality is shrinking quite rapidly. And I think, yeah, it's important to, as you talk about sort of a pot of money, to make that transition to maybe a different looking demographic. But I think there's also a piece that's a little bit about thinking about mobility in terms of what it provides access to and how that might relate to cost savings in other policy areas, I think is quite an important kind of question. And we sort of, yeah, unfortunately, we, like everyone, our same, I think you had the same experience in SMARTA, that it's very difficult to evaluate a mobility solution when nobody is using it because of a global pandemic. So we hope that we will have a chance maybe we've developed a framework, but we hope to have a chance to test it a bit better.
Laurie.
Yeah, I just have a very simple question. I'm very interested in the smart villages, Edina. Extremely interested. I just had one very direct question, really. Several Directorate Generals put money in the pot for the Smart Villages initiative. Was one of them DG Move?
So I wouldn't say that they put money in the pot because it's really the implementation of the smart villages will depend on the member states to start with. So we are not, what DGs put in the pot is their expressed interest that it should be an integrated approach and this technical assistance project. So in fact, there is a steering group of this technical assistance project, which follows very closely the Smart Villages development and of our project, and DG Move is in that steering group. So they are very closely following, and I think they created, already started to create the connection with SMARTA, for instance. So they were really promoting SMARTA to us as well, to cooperate with the projects. I think we should definitely follow that up. So yes, they are fully on board, I think.
Yeah, just to follow on what you said, Adina, I think there are many initiatives, and Isabelle Van Doorn in the first session of the conference mentioned that in the new program for mobility, in the strategy for mobility, they included the rural aspects. My question is, because I flicked through the strategy a bit, you know, how we can address the how well is represented the rural mobility is only a feeder for larger communities, or is an allows through the projects and the strategy to not leave anybody away aside, you know, behind. How is this mentioned is to give access to facilities, to give access to jobs, to give access to different let's say services. Is this is your understanding, you know, because there are two could be interpreted in two ways, you know, feeding the cities, you know, supporting the development of the cities by having a better access to rural community, but in the same time, you know, you can lose the flavor and the tradition and the characteristics, you know, of rural communities. What do you think? And then I'll take questions from the audience for 10 minutes. Any of you? Any point? Yes, Brennan, please.
Two things before we jump to the audience. First of all, I think it would be good that maybe we set up a call next week between SMARTA and Smart Rural 21, as our project ends at the end of this month. So it might be good that we just see how can we debrief you on what we've done, project to project level, but maybe also there could be a bit of a pairing where we have a pilot site in the country and you have a village in the country. So let's put, you know, people in touch with each other. Just want to build on something that Linda was saying, was you know, we're talking about the that there's savings here and savings there and so forth, but you require a whole of government approach for that, and that's actually extremely rare. That we, particularly when we get at national level and national agencies or regional agencies, they tend to work in silos, and just because you get a saving in one area, the other area isn't interested in it. But I think when we get down to the local government layer, where the same administrator, the same budget manager or county manager must deal with all of the elements of the budget, I think that's the place where synergies and savings will be much better appreciated than at the big national agency level. And that brings the issue then, what is the natural home for rural mobility? And it surely is within the lowest level of government or community management that you can reach. So while the formal public transport naturally sits within the Department of Transport or wherever administers that, the management of the local mobility and rural mobility, I think, needs to become more and more within the mandate and the responsibility of the lowest level of local government, and they need to have some funding allocated to them for that purpose.
No, thank you. Odette, please.
I'd just like to add something to what Brendan said. Together with giving the funding to the local authorities to provide in some transport for the community, they also have to understand, and that we feel for the moment that's a very difficult one. If they create transport, they fund the transport, they are responsible for what they create. So if it doesn't work, their inhabitants will come and talk to them. Which idiot has been taking this decision? Who has created that? And now as we come to the finish of our transport plans, we feel in a number of communities that they are a little bit scared. They get a little bit cold feet for the moment because it's something very new for them. Before, always when transport was concerned, they could say, "Oh, it's not us; it's the Flemish region." But now we are both responsible. I'm very interested to see in a couple of years how it will be functioning in reality.
It's very interesting what you said in the session, the previous session, in the session 3, in one of the breakout discussions. It was one interesting comment that everything, the rural mobility schemes should be created with a rural understanding, with a rural mindset. It was very clearly mentioned this, and it was somebody, from an operator that didn't live in that community. And although he tried very much to integrate in the community and understand that particular needs of the community wasn't so open with him, although he supported through the service. And I think the few words that even my colleagues used in the session was trust. Yeah, I will add confidence, because it's mutual. It's trust and confidence, and I think we have to take into account when we discuss with the stakeholders, but especially when we discuss with the people that need mobility. Now, the discussion is excellent, but we have a lot of questions here, and some of them are very, very interesting. And thank you for panelists that already reply to that. I in particular, I like one, and I think it's very interesting, because for me, it's very close to what I think. We build schemes for rural communities, but is there any capacity? Is there any force to take for further different schemes? And for example, what question was, what actual skills could have, a team to develop a rural mobility, to deal with this? It should be, what would be the components of the perfect team from your perspective? Should be, a multidisciplinary one, sociology, psychological background. I think in rural areas, you don't have all of these ones, but just to think about it. What do you think? It's one very interesting question from my point of view. Yeah, it just make me a sign. Who wants to address this one? Yes, Laurie, please.
Well, yeah, just to start this, and it's an excellent question, isn't it? That transport is clearly not the profession that it was 40 years ago, when you had a transport modeler, an engineer, and a transport economist, and that was enough. That now it's recognised that transport had multidisciplinary skills, including ITS. But the problem is that there are very few places, including quite sizable cities, that have the ability to take on a team with such a broad spread of disciplines. Even cities that I know that are really sizable and very state of the art find it very difficult to maintain such a team. So I think it is a very good question that we need to think of ways in which we can channel capacity into local areas where, as has been said, it's very, very essential that is where things are done and financed, to make sure that the benefits of more of a multidisciplinary intelligence come in. And projects like this and the other projects around SMARTA are essential, and how we feed that into these areas.
Thank you. I think there are lots of projects now. It is a momentum. Many projects are funded by the European Commission in different areas, and I think all of them should start discussing and collect all this information, put them in a knowledge base, and distribute it to everybody. Brendan, you wanted to make a comment, please?
Yeah, just again answering that question. Declan Rice made the point yesterday in his presentation on Kilkenny that what they're trying to do, it's not rocket science, because they're not trying to go to the moon, they're trying to go to the next village or the nearby town. But there are skills they have to develop. Now, some of the skills they've already developed quite well, because there's, say, leader action groups and so forth. So they've developed a large amount of skills in mobilizing and implementing projects, mobilizing stakeholders and relationships. But there are specific skills about transportation they need to learn. And just jumping ahead to the presentation I'll make and closing out, one of the last points I make is that capacity building is one of the important enablers that we need to do in the short term. And one of the places we could look towards is in the US, the Rural Transit Assistance Program, National RTAP. And they have a lot of manuals and how to and so forth. So there's a lot that you can download that has been designed specifically for local and community stakeholders and implementers who don't have the background of technical skills, but to be able to bring their knowledge sufficient for purpose in these very areas.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good point, Brandon. And I think local communities should know should learn how to express themselves too. To make themselves very clear in what they want, to express their needs very clear, not only to come somebody to teach them what to talk.
But if I may add, let us not underestimate the skill set that exists within rural and local communities. People who are farmers quite often are underestimated. It's not understood the business that they run, the methods that they have to use and so forth. But likewise, living within the communities are people who generally are very, very skilled, very advanced. And there are a lot of capacities within the community that if you can draw them in on a volunteer or goodwill basis, you actually have a very, very good set of resources available that can be trained up.
Great, thank you. Very short statements from now on, please, because I want to go through through many of these questions. It was the discussion. A few panelists attendees put some questions about the role and the understanding of communities, rural communities. Are they traditional? Are they annexed to urban areas? I think probably we can address this one in a more general way, just having in mind this one. It was one for Linda about taking your point to understand what is the cost of providing accessibility, what is the cost of not providing the accessibility, so maybe this one we can have a thought, Linda, and maybe we can reply. A question for you, Odette, but I noticed that you are writing an answer, and it's very interesting, a huge cost of not funding rural mobility solution, and what is actually the price. And I think this is in a way linked with the other point. So Linda, what is the price of not providing accessibility or rural mobility? It's complex.
Just a nice, easy question to finish up with there. To be honest, I don't know. I mean, I could take some guesses at it, and again, coming back to this, I mean, I think I was listening into the first session this morning on evaluation, and I think, I mean, I would be quite keen to speaking. I think Brendan was talking about, future plans, because SMARTA is now finished, Mamba is already finished. I would be really interested in a new project that actually specifically looks at these evaluation kind of questions, at sort of building our evidence base. We have these pilots now, so we have all these different solutions now operating in different regions, and within Mamba we had these long-term operational concepts that were designed to sort of keep the solutions going beyond the life of the project. But I think what we missed a little bit was a long-term operational concept for the knowledge part of the project. So I think I actually think there's more work to do in this space, and I personally I think it's a very important piece of the puzzle, because we need more evidence for these arguments that we're trying to make, and I think it's quite complex, because we need to look for places where interventions have happened and where they haven't, and that are similar on all other fronts. I think it's quite complex, but I think looking at here today, we have all the brains and we have the solutions going on. We just have to all get together and do this work. Sorry, I didn't answer the question, but that's my thoughts.
No, thank you so much. But I would like to close the discussion, and please be very short and very, very short, one word. If you want to think in one word, what will be the future for rural mobility? What word will express this? Please, Odette.
Cooperation.
Thank you. Laurie.
Oh, that's difficult. It depends.
That's 2 words.
It depends on the Parliament putting pressure on the Commission.
Yeah. Linda.
Universal.
Brendan.
Hope.
Edina.
Maybe diversity, to acknowledge the diversity.
I will say trust again and confidence. I really like trust our rural areas and rural communities that are thriving communities and they are generating nice ideas, and confidence that the message is listened at a higher level. Thank you very, very much and for this lovely discussion. I'm sorry for all the panelists that I didn't put for the attendees that I didn't put all the questions, but they we will take care of them. Once again, thank you very much, and I will close this this session with Brendan, giving him the floor to make the final presentation of SMARTA. Have a nice day. Thank you very much.
Okay, Lucia, you can see the screen?
Yes, we can see. Excellent.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be brief. And okay, hopefully the slides will work. Yes, down here. Okay, I want to basically close out with where we think this goes towards the future. And to a large extent, I'm presenting mostly Andrea's slides from yesterday with one added on. And we've discussed at length, and I think we're agreed, what's the problem in rural mobility? There's a lack of policy, a lack of responsibilities, and then that flows into a lack of action. Although, as has been pointed out, and we've particularly seen from Flanders, is that there are regions who implement themselves. For those that don't implement, the consequence is that there's a limited supply of services, and that in turn means that there's limited mobility for people without cars, and there's limited choices for people who do have cars. We discussed how can Europe act on rural mobility, and indeed we discussed yesterday why they should. But assuming they agree that they should act, then we said there's 2 different ways in which they should act. One is they should act at the European level to ensure that rural mobility is included across all the policy areas. And part of our discussion yesterday was how well or otherwise it had been included in the smart and sustainable mobility part of the Green Deal. The second is to place the obligation on the member states that rural mobility should be mandatory in their policies. So to require member states to establish national policies, and from there, we look towards that the goal should be to have target-bound rural mobility policy in all the member states by 2025 and effective frameworks by 2030. We still say, look, what you actually do, coverage, service levels, means of delivery, all of those things is entirely the prerogative of the individual member state. What is not acceptable is that you continue with no mandated levels of service, no assigned responsibilities, and no funding to make sure that they get implemented. We set out an idea of a roadmap that over the next 2 years, that there's basically the discussion phase in which there's a decision that things need to be done and a broad agreement on how to go about it. Following from that, to actually start to act, that the Parliament would issue a directive, or indeed it may be some other mechanism they would use, but that will put the obligation on the member states to mobilize the development of mobility plans. We've seen in the Flanders case that it can be done, so there is no reason why the other member states can't do it within their competences as well. So that from 2025, the obligation will be there to act, and that the policies will be put in place. And then over the subsequent 5 years is that the framework to implement those policies will be put in place so that by 2030, there will be effective frameworks in place that will cover every part of the European Union territory. And again, we've seen that this timeline is broadly in keeping with, I think maybe Odette might give us some more information, but this is broadly in keeping with about a 5-year timeline that it takes from the get-go to be able to get the structure in place. But that's what the European level might do. But what can be done at the local level? And then Andrea presented this diagram that you might see more of in the future, where we look at 3 phases for implementing at the local level. The first is the mobilization and preparatory phase. And Adina will note that this actually looks very similar to the Smart Villages roadmap that she had set out herself. To develop a strategy based on assessment of local needs, engage with stakeholders and gain the buy-in, mobilize an implementation team, and start to secure the funding for at least the first phase of your strategy. Now, this is something that can take a very long time, and we've seen this from the pilot sites and others, that this could be a decade in the making, where you actually get the people to work together. But in some communities, that may already have been done for other, for projects in other domains, so you may have a good starting point. You then move into the developing the solution phase. You decide what it is you're going to do exactly. You build the capacity to implement it, and you acquire the mobility services either in-house or you procure them, the supporting technologies, and you're good to go. And then you move into the operations phase and the long-term sustainability. So step 8 is to implement the mobility services, put them in place. But the one that we see is not being done very well, step 9, is to build up the usage levels through marketing, outreach, and community engagement. This was something we discussed at length in breakout workshop number 3, is building up the business and working very closely with the communities to make it happen. But having got to that stage, the next step is to lock it in. So to work with primary stakeholders such as ministries, local governments, and so forth, to ensure that there will be durable funding, ideally embedded in the policy or the 5-year plans for the area, and then to move on to the fine-tuning, adapting the services, and to consider extending and expanding to other areas or other contexts. What's a package of measures? What might you consider? Well, we see our atomium, as we call it, with all the different solution sets. And the package of measures is basically going to be, what does the area need? What can you afford? What can you prioritize? And it could be big measures or it could be very small measures. So we give an example here that you have some level of conventional public transport that's either in your area or it's nearby with which you can connect. Some kind of flexible mobility services, they could be general or they could be dedicated, DRT, shared taxi and so forth, that gives the local mobility. But then start to work on the other resources that we've heard about a lot today, the organized lift giving, the organized or the informal ride sharing, carpooling, hitchhiking and so forth, asset sharing, and anything else that may be suitable within the area. And this comes back again to what can an area afford? Even if you have very little money, but if you have goodwill and volunteering from within your community, you can achieve a lot of this. So it's about designing the package that best fits both the context and the affordability that you have. So I'll close on this slide is what enablers would make a difference quite quickly. And I identify 3. The first is networking. And I think this is a very important one. We need to continue the dialogue. Linda has already mentioned it. Last Mile has closed. We are closing. Mamba is closing. Has closed already, inclusion and so forth. But the conversation shouldn't stop there. The other is use networking to build relationships among the various implementing sites and practitioners, of which there's 60, 80, 100 that have worked with various projects over the last few years. And I think one of the key things would be to establish a rural mobility forum as a focal point and as a voice for the sector. But who might do this? We don't have an equivalent in the rural areas of POLIS or UITP or UMTA and so forth. So maybe this could sit under the European Rural Parliament or Smart Villages or some other rural network. A discussion for another day, but hopefully not too far away. The second area is capacity development, which we've already discussed in the panel. Local implementers need a structured program of capacity development, support, and how-to manuals. We've seen already for Resopus, for organized hitchhiking, for Burgerbus, the manuals are out there for those particular countries, and that's a very, very good starting point for communities to be able to do things, but they're in a specific language, in a specific context, so can we broaden these out? In terms of capacity building, we have standard areas such as need assessment, planning, operations, resource optimization, but there are new skill areas, and Workshop 4 brought this to the fore. ITS, apps, data, business, and then business models and marketing. These are things that are not traditionally done, and they need to be developed as well. And I already referenced the US Rural Transit Assistance Program as a good model that we could look at and maybe either copy or develop our own in Europe. And the third and final strand for me that could be done quickly is the funding, is to include mobility as a specific item within rural development programs, such as LEADER, not necessarily a dedicated funding line for rural mobility, but rather to ensure that it's funded or included as an enabling measure in broader packages such as smart villages. Assist innovation, but in doing so, prioritize mobility outcomes over devices. So the innovation could be in a social mechanism, it could be in a governance mechanism, it could be an outreach mechanism, or it could be a gadget. But don't simply spend the money on gadgets because they are what is associated with innovation. Always say, what will it achieve? The other area is about leveraging social health and training and tourism initiatives. We've seen it done very nicely, for example, by Local Link Donegal up in the northwest of Ireland, where they've worked very closely with the healthcare services so that they're able to get more funding and be able to provide more service to the general public. And the final one is to look at removing barriers and costs for community and volunteer initiatives. And we heard very well that in Germany, the Bürgerbus, the mechanism is there to overcome the problems of regulation, of insurance and so forth. Whereas in Ireland, just to give an example, we would be dead in the water trying doing this because of the very high cost and problems of getting insurance. So I just want to leave you with those thoughts: networking, capacity development, funding, and those are areas that our sponsors in the Parliament and the DGs would be able to maybe look at what could be done within the next, say, 6 to 12 months to mobilize and then be available during 22 and 23. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you so much. It was very interesting, and I think there are strong results from SMARTA coming up. And as you correctly said, I think these have to be taken further on and integrated with the rest of initiatives that are emerging from now on rural mobilities, rural mobility, rural communities, and in general in small areas. I would like to close this session thanking first of all everybody for your patience with us. We are 15 minutes late in this one, but I think the discussion was very good. I would like to thank everybody that attended all SMARTA final conference, but all the SMARTA events in especially this year. Altogether, I think we had an interest of about 700, 1,000. I don't know. My colleagues will make some calculations later from yourselves. We have almost all continents, if not all continents, represented as interest in SMARTA. I think only today in this particular session we have representatives from Japan, from Africa, and so on. So I'm extremely grateful for this interest in SMARTA, and I would like this momentum to be preserved, and let's continue the dialogue about rural mobility because it matters. Thank you very much to everybody. Have a nice day, nice weekend, and stay safe and well. Happy holidays to everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.